Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is about the second reading for part 2 of our book. So it's the 4 fundamental questions. The first fundamental question was who or what am I? And the second fundamental question is what is real? So the first reading was Plato's Republic. The second reading is the Tao Te Ching. And it's spelled Tao Te Ching. I don't know why they spell it with a T if it's pronounced like a D, but that is the way it is. And the second discussion question will ask us to compare the Tao Te Ching to Plato's cave allegory from the Republic. So that is going to take the majority of the time for this video, but let me begin with the first discussion question on page 177. Given that we cannot talk about the Tao, how can there be 81 chapters in the Tao Te Ching? Explain. So the first verse on page 161, verse 1.1, the Tao that can be told of is not the absolute Tao. The names that can be given are not absolute names. So you cannot talk about the Tao. That's the beginning of the Tao Te Ching. All right, then. If you can't talk about it and you can't give it a name, then why did you write 81 verses about it? So I think the best way for me to explain it, especially for this class, is to turn to another reading that we'll have in part 2 of this book, Henri Bergson, on page, if you look on page 213. So this is his, this chapter is called An Introduction to Metaphysics, and he differentiates between 2 types of knowing, analysis and intuition. And he'll say analysis is knowing something from the outside, observing it as an object. So I'm analyzing, this computer mouse. I'm looking at it. I can say, oh, it's kind of oblong, kind of like plastic. It's black. It's got a red light on the bottom. So what Bergson will say is all of those words you used are symbols that represent the thing. That it's black, but so are a lot of things. So you're using words that relate to a lot of other things to explain what this thing is. So you're using words that explain things that it's not to help explain what it is. You never get to the thing itself. You're always comparing it to other things. So, and that's the nature of words. Any word you use to describe anything, that same word can be used to describe a lot of other things. What's unique about the thing itself? Well, if there was a word that you could use to describe it, it wouldn't be unique. You'd be comparing it to other things. Therefore, if there is anything that's unique in anything, to know it, you wouldn't be able to use a word to describe it. You'd have to know it by being the thing. So, is it possible to become objects outside of your body and know what they are from within? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but Bergson says at least we know who we are from within. You can at least have an intuition of yourself, but then you would not be able to translate that intuition into symbolic language for the reasons I explained already. So on page 213, the bottom paragraph, he says, the flow of his own consciousness, the duration of his own sense of self. He says, it is true that no image can reproduce exactly the original feeling I have of the flow of my own conscious life. So no image can reproduce that exactly, no words, no picture or any kind of symbolic communication, he says, but it is not even necessary that I should attempt to render it. If a man is incapable of getting for himself the intuition of the constitutive duration of his own being, nothing will ever give it to him, concepts no more than images. Here the single aim of the philosopher should be, so this is what I'm saying the Tao Te Ching is trying to do. So here, the single aim of the philosopher should be to promote a certain effort, which in most men is usually fettered by habits of mind more useful to life. So he's saying you can use words and images to try to inspire people to make a certain kind of an effort. He's going to explain later it's a psychological effort that normally people don't waste that kind of mental energy trying to do because there's more practical problems to be dealt with. So here's how the philosopher is supposed to promote this kind of an effort. Now, the image has at least this advantage, that it keeps us in the concrete. No image can replace the intuition of duration. So that's the duration of your own self-awareness. So no image can replace that intuition, but many diverse images, borrowed from very different orders of things, may, by the convergence of their action, direct consciousness to the precise point where there is a certain intuition to be seized. By choosing images as dissimilar as possible, we shall prevent any one of them from usurping the place of the intuition it is intended to call up. So a few sentences later on page 214, he says, but then consciousness must at least consent to make the effort, for it will have been shown nothing. It will simply have been placed in the attitude it must take up in order to make the desired effort, and so come by itself to the intuition. So using images from all different directions, opposite types of images, you're trying to get, Bergson says the philosopher is trying to zero in people's consciousness to a certain point where an intuition can be made. And the intuition is of the duration of the self, which is the same thing as the Tao. The core, the root of your being is the Tao. It can't be described with words, but the words, if they're properly chosen, can create images and philosophical concepts that prepare the reader to have this insight of the Tao, or whatever word you want to give to this ultimate source of things. All right, so the next discussion question on page 177, compare the view of reality found here with the one found in Plato's allegory of the cave. Which one makes more sense to you? Why? Explain. So the allegory of the cave is one part of Plato's Republic, which was the first reading for part 2 of the book. And so I'll briefly go over the cave allegory, and then we'll compare it to the Tao Te Ching. And to begin with, they're very similar. They're not that different, although the Tao doesn't use that allegory of prisoners locked up in a cave. And also, before I forget, I did put up on the YouTube section, I know these lectures are linked to YouTube, but then there's another on our content tab, it just says YouTube. I added a few short clips from the movie The Matrix. So it's a lot of people compare The Matrix to Plato's cave allegory. So you can think in terms of Neo taking the red pill and then realizing, oh, what I thought was my reality is really an illusion. I'm locked up in some kind of an egg-like incubator, and this is all a computer simulation. It's very similar to Plato's cave allegory, so that's why I included those clips if you're interested. All right, so to briefly summarize the cave allegory, Socrates is talking to his friends, and he says, imagine prisoners taken to an underground cave as children. So I would assume younger than they would be able to remember this happening when they grow up. And they're chained, their heads are chained, their legs are chained, so they can't look behind them. Behind them, above the entrance of the cave, is a blazing fire. And then between the fire and the prisoners, guards walk back and forth in front of a wall, like marionette puppeteers use to hide their bodies while they hold puppets up above the wall. And the fire casts the shadows of the puppets on the back wall that the prisoners are facing, and also the shadows of the prisoners themselves. So the prisoners can see their own shadows, they can see the shadows of their neighbors, they can see the shadows of the puppets, and they can hear the echoes of the guards walking back and forth and talking off the back of the wall of the cave. And they think that's reality. They think that's the totality of reality, these two-dimensional shadows and these echoes. And then somebody comes out of the cave, from above outside of the cave, from the world outside, releases a prisoner from the chains, turns them around, it dazzles their eyes. They think the shadows are still reality and what they're being shown now is madness. Then they're dragged up out of the cave. The sunlight burns their eyes. They have to acclimate themselves to the daylight at first. At night, they can see stars and planets. They can see reflections of things in water. And eventually they can see the sun itself, which they realize is the source of everything in the world outside the cave and of the entire shadow world inside the cave. Then they're told they have to go back and free another prisoner. Their eyes become blinded by the darkness. People think they're insane. They'd rather kill that person than allow them to make them as mad and blind as they seem to be. But eventually the person who's coming back into the cave from outside, their eyes get adjusted to the darkness, and then they can see and predict the pattern of the shadows as they pass on the wall 10,000 times better than anybody else, because they can just turn around and see what's coming. So there's the cave allegory. Then Socrates says, so as the cave was in relation to the world outside the cave, where the sun is and the three-dimensional objects are, so is this world, this visible world, like a shadow world inside a cave compared to the eternal world of absolute ideas or absolute forms of knowledge, the highest of which is the idea of the good, of which the sun is like a shadow. The brilliant sun is like a shadow or a simulation of the idea of the good, the spiritual sun, the eternal archetype of the sun. So that idea of the good that Socrates describes is very much like the Tao, which is also very much like the Hindu concept of Vishnu, which is just their word for God, Descartes' God, the idea of the good, the Tao. These are all very similar. One thing about the Tao and the idea of the good, they're not as overtly personified the way the Christian God and the Hindu God is. They call the ultimate source of everything a person, a he. Whereas Plato doesn't overtly do that, and neither does the Tao Te Ching. But still, it serves as the source of everything, including our own consciousness of self. So if we have a sense of self, it would indicate the idea of the good has a sense of self. The Tao has some kind of a sense of self. That could be debated. But I will read the part of the cave allegory where Socrates translates each part of the allegory and describes. On the bottom of page 153, he says, this entire allegory I said you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight, the light of the fire is the sun, and you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which at your desire I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort, and when seen is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. So, the source of the visible world and the source of the intellectual world, that's the idea of the good. So going back to the Tao Te Ching, how does that compare? So compare the view of reality found here. This is on page 177, question 2. Compare the view of reality found here with the one found in Plato's allegory of the cave. Which one makes more sense to you? Why? Explain. So the way the question's framed, it implies that they're different, but they're not that different, really. In both of them, Lao Tzu is saying, that's the author of the Tao Te Ching, he's saying you have to be aware of the Tao in order to be a worthy king. In order to rule a nation, you have to see or become aware of guide your life by the Tao, which is exactly what Plato or Socrates said in the cave allegory. Only someone who has seen this idea of the good with the eye of the soul is able to act justly in private life or in public life. And he also goes on to say, unless you provide this vision to your rulers, all you're going to get is people squabbling for wealth and power, thinking that they can benefit their own personal lives if they can take hold of the levers of power. And then that'll be the ruin of the state. The Tao Te Ching says the same thing. So as long as I'm talking about that, let's just go to that part. So the Philosopher King sections, all right, 13.4. If you turn to section 13.4 on page 163. Therefore, this is the bottom of page 163. Therefore, he who values the world as his self may then be entrusted with the government of the world, and he who loves the world as his self, the world, may then be entrusted to his care. So if you see the idea of the good in Plato's cave allegory is the source of everything, it's the source of yourself. And if you identify yourself with that supreme self, then you identify yourself with everything. So in the Bible, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So Sigmund Freud, the atheistic psychologist, said, that's asking too much. How can I love someone who isn't me as if they were? Because they're not me. He was a materialist. He thought consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. My brain's different from everyone else's brain, so it's a lie to say I can love them as myself, because they're simply not the self. But in the Bible, Jesus had two commandments. The second one was love your neighbor as yourself. The first was love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. So to love your neighbor as yourself is impossible unless you and your neighbor share some ultimate supreme self, and that's what God is. If you love God and God is everyone, then it's reasonable to say that you would love others. You can think that, but I gather from here, unless you truly realize your oneness with the Tao, then you won't have that same instinctive self-love projected onto the world. But if you do have this ultimate insight, then you'll naturally love everyone as yourself, and then you'll become a worthy political ruler. That you can only have a just and harmonious society if the rulers have this insight into the Tao, or the idea of the good. On section 16.3, page 164, Lao Tzu says, to return to the root is repose. It is called going back to one's destiny. Going back to one's destiny is to find the eternal law. To know the eternal law is enlightenment, and not to know the eternal law is to court disaster. The next verse, he who knows the eternal law is tolerant. Being tolerant, he is impartial. Being impartial, he is kingly. Being kingly, he is in accord with nature. Being in accord with nature, he is in accord with Tao. So the eternal law is found by returning to the root of being. All right, so the Tao Te Ching, it's unlike Plato's cave allegory. It's not a dialogue between people, and it's not an allegory. It's a series of allegories presented by one person, Lao Tzu. And so it's the cave allegory is a compact thought experiment. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everything has its place. The Tao Te Ching, everything might also be very specifically aligned, but it's not overtly following any kind of particular plan like the allegory of the cave. It's a series of short, wise sayings, a series of aphorisms that they seem to be linked, but not in any strict and definite way. It seems if you move some lines and switch their places, it wouldn't change the overall meaning of the whole text. Maybe it would. Maybe there's some underlying ordering principle that it's following, but at least at the surface, it looks to be just kind of a series of collections of aphorisms. But what it has in common with the cave allegory is it's, for one thing, it's a cosmology. Plato's cave allegory says this material universe is a shadow of another world of eternal forms. And Lao Tzu talks about the universe and the cosmic mystery, and I'm going to get into a few of those verses, but I think it will help to understand what he's saying when we compare it to the current cosmology of the creation of the universe, which is what Lao Tzu talks about. You have to return to the root, the origin of the universe in order to gain the eternal law by which to rule justly. So I've said it before, I've put up videos about it, and I just think it's pertinent for this writing also. According to the current Big Bang theory, now I've explained this before, there's relativity theory, which describes nature at its largest scales. Then there's quantum mechanics, which describes things at their tiniest scales. And those two mathematical languages don't work together. You can't use quantum mechanics to describe enormous things like galaxies and fast moving things are governed by or described by special relativity and general relativity. And you can't use relativity, either special or general, to describe things at the quantum scales. String theory weaves these two languages together, but it can't be empirically verified because the fundamental strings they talk about are too small to be observed, and the compactified dimensions of space are too small to be observed. But mathematically, apparently, it works. And that interpretation of the Big Bang, I think, is especially similar to a lot of ancient cosmologies. The Hindu cosmology, Plato's cosmology, St. Augustine's cosmology, Aquinas's Aristotle's, they have this one thing, this shape of the universe and the relation between the original central point and the encompassing horizon. This is an important cosmological idea that resurfaces, it seems, throughout history. It seems to be resurfacing now, according to Leonard Susskind, a Stanford University string theorist. Just to explain the most basic point for comparing it to the Tao Te Ching, our universe is one of innumerable universes. It emerged from what's called the quantum vacuum, this underlying every point of three-dimensional space is this ocean of waves of probability, which is infinitely energetic at each point. So one of these points of the quantum vacuum inflates in an explosion, the Big Bang. The point is called a singularity, a point of infinite density. And we live in a universe now where that central singularity, anywhere you are in the universe, it appears from your perspective that you are the center of an expanding universe. And as space expands and reaches the speed of light, that's the cosmic horizon. And according to this holographic string theory, every bit of information from the past, present, and future of the entire universe is interwoven at each point of the encompassing sphere and then radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation, to create the three-dimensional world around us. I read from Brian Greene, Columbia University string theorist, where he compares that holographic string theory to Plato's cave allegory. The similarities are clear. This material world of three-dimensional objects is an illusion projected from an eternal realm where the past, present, and future coexist. The problem, says Brian Greene, with the metaphor is that the source of everything is a flat two-dimensional screen, which seems to reverse Plato's cave allegory, because the world of shadows was a two-dimensional shadow on a wall. So the difference is that what appears to be the cosmic horizon from our perspective on Earth, if you were out at that distant border, you would think that you're at the center of the universe, and we here on Earth are at the cosmic horizon. So it's not a fixed, concrete rigid system where there's a center and a sphere. The two unite with each other, and we'll see that in the Tao Te Ching when they talk about the source and the farthest gate. So we're going to get to that momentarily. And then the last piece is near-death experiences. Plato writes about one at the end of the Republic, the myth of a soldier who observed everything from outside of the universe, and he saw how a person's destiny, the threads of destiny for their next lives, were woven first into the outermost sphere of the cosmos and then through each concentric sphere down to Earth. Carl Jung, the psychologist who followed Freud and then rejected his materialism, he claimed during his near-death experience that it seemed to him as if the past, present, and future was interwoven at the cosmic horizon, and that each of us here in the three-dimensional world is like in a little box, a cube-like prison, which is tethered to the horizon by a thread. So it's very similar to what you read in these ancient texts, and with that in mind, I think it helps to understand what Lao Tzu says here in the Tao Te Ching. So I'll just read a few of the most pertinent points that I think relay this relationship between the original point, the singularity from which the universe emerges, and the cosmic horizon. So on page 161, we already read verse 1.1 that the Tao cannot be named. So verse 1.2, the nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of all things. So what I'm going to say here is that the origin of heaven and earth, that's the central singularity. The mother of all things is the cosmic horizon. That's the language Plato uses to describe the cosmic horizon in the Timaeus. He calls it the mother substance. St. Augustine calls that what he calls the heaven of heaven, the surrounding sphere, the mother. So I think it seems to me that's what's being referred to here in the Tao Te Ching. So verse 1.3, therefore oftentimes one strips oneself of passion in order to see the secret of life. Oftentimes one regards life with passion in order to see its manifest forms. These two, the secret and its manifestations, are in their nature the same. They are given different names when they become manifest. So if you translate the secret as the source, the singularity, which is one with the cosmic horizon, and then the three-dimensional world as its manifestations, it seems to be that's the kind of relationship that Lao Tzu is talking about. Continuing on verse 1.5, he says, they may both be called the cosmic mystery. Reaching from the mystery into the deeper mystery is the gate to the secret of all life. So the way I would look at it from this current cosmology is, if you understand how the universe was originally contained in a single point and then expanded and contains itself at each point of the cosmic horizon, if you understand that relationship and how the cosmic horizon radiates this three-dimensional what's the word that Susskind uses? Cinematic hologram. The gate to the secret of all life would be the cosmic horizon. So I'm going to just continue with this on verse 14.3. He says, not by its rising is there light, nor by its sinking is there darkness, unceasing, continuous, it cannot be defined. It reverts again to the realm of nothingness. That is why it is called the form of the formless, the image of nothingness. That is why it is called the elusive. Meet it, and you do not see its face. Follow it, and you do not see its back. So that, again, is similar, I think, to the relationship between the singularity and the cosmic horizon. You can't see either one. As you approach the horizon with a physical body, it recedes. With every step you take towards it, it recedes one step. And you can't see the singularity inside a black hole because light can't get out of the black hole. Gravity's stronger than light beyond the event horizon. And furthermore, the singularity and the cosmic horizon revert into each other depending upon your perspective. So that's what I'm trying to keep in mind here as I continue. On page 164, verse 16.3, he says, to return to the root is repose. It is called going back to one's destiny. And I talked about this earlier. Going back to one's destiny is to find the eternal law. To know the eternal law is enlightenment, and not to know the eternal law is to court disaster. So to return to the root of being is the singularity, which Plato calls the idea of the good, the root, the source of consciousness and everything visible, of visible light and intellectual light. And that is where the eternal law resides. So according to Plato, this material world is a shadow of the spiritual world of eternal forms. According to holographic string theory, these three-dimensional forms that we perceive are projected from an eternal realm, the cosmic horizon, where all of the information of everything that ever happened or will happen is condensed in each point. So it's very similar to what Plato's trying to say. The eternal law is found at the outermost horizon of the cosmos. That is what Plato says in his various dialogues. It's what St. Augustine says following Plato. The ideas of God's mind are out at the furthest most sphere of the universe. And that seems to be similar to what Lao Tzu is saying here on 16.3. So to return to the root, the singularity is located at each point of the horizon. If you return to that outermost border, then you are one with the eternal forms of knowledge that radiate this three-dimensional temporary world into existence. On page 165, verse 22.2, he says, therefore the sage embraces the one and becomes the model of the world. He does not reveal himself and is therefore luminous. He does not justify himself and is therefore far famed. So you cannot empirically observe the singularity. You can't see it, and yet it's the source of all light. The sage who embraces the one, or the Tao, or the idea of the good, becomes luminous to others in some kind of a subconscious level. And you don't, that sage who's realized the one doesn't need to say, I have realized the one. That person should become self-luminous and automatically far famed. On page 166, verse 25.1, he says, before the heaven and earth existed, there was something nebulous, silent, isolated, standing alone, changing not, eternally revolving, without fail, worthy to be the mother of all things. I do not know its name and address it as Tao. If forced to give it a name, I shall call it Great. So this next verse is the one that's most clearly similar to the current Big Bang cosmology. He says, being great implies reaching out in space. Reaching out in space implies far-reaching. Far-reaching implies reversion to the original point. So, being great, the singularity is a point of infinite density. That's the most power that you can have, infinite power. It implies reaching out in space. The singularity expands out and creates space out of itself. Reaching out in space implies far-reaching. The farthest you can reach in the universe is to the horizon of the cosmos, where space is expanding at the speed of light. So continuing here, far-reaching implies reversion to the original point. The original singularity is also located at each point of the cosmic horizon. When people recall their near-death experiences, a lot of times they say, I felt myself traveling through space faster and faster until it seemed I was hurtling through a dark tunnel towards a point of all loving light. So according to relativity theory, if you were to travel faster and faster through space, it would be the same as becoming heavier and heavier, and all of the light from the stars behind you would, the faster you went, the more they would get crunched into a smaller and smaller circle until, as you approach the speed of light, the entire universe in front of and behind you would be condensed into a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. That's what relativity theory says you would experience if you could travel at close to light speed. That is what people say they've experienced during these out-of-body near-death experiences. But going back to this Tao Te Ching, so with that in mind, I'll read this again. Being great implies reaching out in space. So great is the word he gives to the Tao. So being the Tao implies reaching out in space. Reaching out in space in space implies far-reaching. Far-reaching implies reversion to the original point, so a reversion to the Tao. Continuing here on verse 25.4, therefore Tao is great, the heaven is great, the earth is great, the king is also great. These are the great four in the universe, and the king is one of them. It's very similar to Plato's idea of the philosopher king. Once someone's been trained to make that intellectual effort where the eye of the soul turns inward to perceive the idea of the good, that person it becomes that person's duty to become the king, even though they would rather not go back down into the cave and deal with mundane affairs. That's what they are supposed to do, because they owe it to the state that educated them. So there's other verses. Page 168, verse 40.1. Reversion is the action of the Tao. Gentleness is the function of the Tao. Verse 42.2. The created universe carries the yin at its back and the yang in front. Through the union of the pervading principles, it reaches harmony. So the yin and the yang is actually how you pronounce it. The feminine and masculine principles, they intertwine, they become each other. I can see a relationship between the singularity and the cosmic horizon would be the yin, the feminine, because it absorbs everything and then gives birth to everything again. But it interchanges with the central point, which I would suppose would be the yang, if the cosmic horizon is the yin. So that relationship between those two cosmic principles, yin and yang, I think can be seen as a relationship between the central point and the surrounding sphere. On page 170, verse 52.1, he says, there was a beginning of the universe, which may be regarded as the mother of the universe. From the mother, we may know her sons. After knowing the sons, keep to the mother. So the sons are all the manifestations, the three-dimensional world. So after knowing about the three-dimensional world, it's better to keep to meditating upon the mother, or the source of everything, where all space and time are contained, which is the Tao. So there's on page 173, verse 65.4, he says, when the mystic virtue becomes clear, far-reaching, and things revert back to their source, then and then only emerges the grand harmony. So again, this idea of far-reaching until you revert back to your original source, that's the grand harmony that you must have in order to act justly in private life or in public life. That's what Socrates says, and it's very similar to what Lao Tzu is saying. All right, so there are some differences, though. Well, it's actually not that different from, in Plato's Republic, Socrates is creating the ideal just society, because he thinks the city is like an expanded version of the individual soul. It's easier to see an expanded version, so if we can create a just society, we can find where justice is given in the individual soul. And part of this just state is the idea of educating an elite segment of the community to have this ultimate vision of the idea of the good. But the rest of the people are supposed to be told a noble lie about their origin, and that the noble lie is, oh, you were all born from the earth is your mother. This country, this land, the soil of our little city-state, that's your actual mother. So the masses of people are kept in ignorance. That is also what Lao Tzu says. He says, I'll just go through, I'll say the verses where he mentions this idea, and then I'll go through a couple of them. Verse 3.1, verse 3.5, verse 20.1, verse 47.1, 65.1 and 2, and 81.3. Those are all places where he says, too much knowledge is not a good thing. Keep the people basically uneducated, because if they gain a little bit of education, then everything gets complicated. I'll just read through a few of these verses. So 3.1 on page 162. Exalt not the wise, so that the people shall not scheme and contend. Verse 3.5, so that the people may be innocent of knowledge and desires, and the cunning ones shall not presume to interfere. Oh, so you have to read the first verse before that. Therefore, in the government of the sage, he keeps empty their hearts, makes full their bellies, discourages their ambitions, strengthens their frames, so that the people may be innocent of knowledge and desires, and the cunning ones shall not presume to interfere. Verse 20.1, the bottom of page 164, banish learning and vexation's end. Verse 65.1 and 2, he says, the ancients who knew, this is page 173 at the top, the ancients who knew how to follow the Tao aimed not to enlighten the peoples, but to keep them ignorant. The reason it is difficult for the people to live in peace is because of too much knowledge. Those who seek to rule a country by knowledge are the nation's curse. Those who seek not to rule a country by knowledge are the nation's blessing. So that seems, I don't know, it doesn't ring very well with a person who grew up in a society where public education is a right of each citizen. But it is similar to what Plato says, although not in the cave allegory that we discussed. All right, so discussion question 3 on page 177. Pick your favorite 5 of the chapters included here. So by chapters, he means verses. Explain what the ideas mean and why you like them. So I've gone over some of the 25.3, for example. That's my favorite verse from the Tao Te Ching because it's most similar to this Big Bang idea and the cosmic horizon that I'm interested in. So I'll read that one again. Being great implies reaching out in space. Reaching out in space implies far-reaching. Far-reaching implies reversion to the original point. Then he talks about how that's the Tao. Another one that I think of occasionally is verse 8.1 at the bottom of page 162. He says, the best of men is like water. Water benefits all things and does not compete with them. It dwells in the lowly places that all disdain, where it comes near to the Tao. So water, you need it for life, but it's at the bottom of the gutter where the filth is. It's not, it'll go wherever it needs to go, and it always seeks out the lowliest places. So that just seems like a poetic image that stuck in my mind over the years. So if that's one of the questions that is an option on the exam and you choose it, just explain what you think each of these verses means, and keep in mind that the entire Tao Te Ching is rooted to the idea of the Tao's, the source and the container of everything. It's the eternal law that governs all being is the Tao. Very similar to Plato's idea of the good. Okay, so that will wrap it up for the Tao Te Ching, and the next reading that I'll be going over, the next reading in our book, is On the Nature of Things by Lucretius. So this is the opposite perspective of some kind of a mystical source, an intangible, empirically unobservable source of everything, which is what Plato and the Hindus and the Tao Te Ching talk about. Lucretius is a materialist, and he's going to explain, following Democritus, the ancient Greek philosopher, that everything is ultimately can be reduced to tiny bits of soulless matter interacting in an infinite void, an infinite number of little material particles interacting over an infinite amount of time in an infinite void. There's no soul. So, although I'll just point out here, even Lucretius will admit this isn't an empirical philosophy because those little tiny atoms are too small to see. But at any rate, we'll pick up on the next video.